Hello, everybody. Welcome to the library. Today, I want to talk to you about something very near and dear to my heart: survival horror. The mid to late 90s and early 2000s was chock full of dark and tactful survival horror games that greatly impacted my generation of gaming. Titles such as Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, Dino Crisis, Alone in the Dark, Countdown Vampires, and many more flooded consoles at that time. These were the founding titles of the genre. Aside from all those, though, one stands above them all and is considered the juggernaut of survival horror. I am, of course, talking about Resident Evil. For those of you that may already know me, or if this is your first time getting to know me, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Resident Evil is a very special franchise to me, and millions of other people. It left a profound impact on me that's tough to explain. It scarred me, but in a good way. Playing these games for the first time when I was younger, and just the sheer terror that I felt playing them, is something that's almost never been matched again in my life. Now that I'm older, I embrace these games and the indelible mark they left on me, and the fact that they're still just fun as hell to play. I knew a time would come on my channel here when I would bring Resident Evil into the picture. And today's that day. But first, a crash course. Resident Evil is a franchise that began in 1996 and is still going strong today, with 8 numbered entries and a 9th one set to release next year in February 2026. There are a number of spin-off titles, animated films, comics, and lore, and also some really bad attempts from Hollywood to make films about it that we won't talk about. Despite that, though, Resident Evil is still at the top of its game and doesn't show any signs of slowing down anytime soon. The franchise will be celebrating its 30th anniversary next year with the release of Resident Evil 9. Now look, I'll address the elephant in the room. I know how popular Resident Evil is in mainstream society. I know how many videos there are on YouTube of people talking about what big fans they are. There are countless videos talking about its history and its lore and, fan theories and, just the impact it's had, like, in society as a whole is monumental. Throughout the next few months, I will be deep diving, talking in depth about each Resident Evil title. This video here today will not be a deep dive per se, but rather an introductory video, sifting through the history of Resident Evil and my connection to each title. Now, this will only consist of the games, not the movies or the comics or anything else, just the video games, the entire timeline of Resident Evil games. Let's begin. It began in 1996 with the release of a game called Biohazard in Japan. Biohazard was imported over to American consoles and given the name Resident Evil, and the rest is history. Resident Evil burst onto the scene in 1996 and launched a frightening new style of gameplay, the likes of which no one had ever seen before that. Soon, several other developers and gaming companies were all jumping at the opportunity and attempting to replicate the exact same style that Resident Evil pioneered. Released in 1996 on the PlayStation 1, and then receiving a from-the-ground-up remake in 2001 on the Nintendo GameCube, the very first Resident Evil game is a classic, known for its unique fixed camera angles and what everyone has dubbed tank controls. The old-style survival horror games in the 19s and 20s like Silent Hill and Dino Crisis and all the others mirrored what was started by Resident Evil. You could even say that Resident Evil took its influence from a few other horror games prior to it, like Clock Tower, for instance, which was scary as hell. The point is, in this new generation of games, Resident Evil had created a new type of game style. The horror genre was changed forever, and Resident Evil was at the forefront of it. My first experience with the original game, though, was on the Nintendo GameCube in 2003. My Resident Evil journey did not actually begin with the first game. It began with the second game. I played Resident Evil 2 on my friend's PlayStation way back in the day, and eventually it was ported onto the Nintendo 64. Sorry, my parents only allowed us one console. But the point is, when it finally was, I was able to experience Resident Evil 2 at home, and boy, let me tell you, no other game has given me more nightmares in my life than Resident Evil 2. It was a bigger, bolder, more ambitious game. It took things to the next level, and it introduced some of my favorite characters in the franchise for the first time. Like its predecessor, Resident Evil 2 received a full remake in 2019 also that only made the experience as a whole better. I will go more into my journey with Resident Evil 2, of course, when I post my full video deep diving later on. Things continued a couple of years later on with the release of Resident Evil 3, Nemesis. This one tried out something a bit different, something they had briefly tried in Resident Evil 2 but went all out with in this third game. Resident Evil 3 had the terrifying abomination that would become known as the Nemesis that would constantly stalk you throughout the game. This one also kind of took things back a little bit in the timeline, and it actually takes place before Resident Evil 2. Now, I personally did not get a chance to play Resident Evil 3 Nemesis until around 2018 when a port finally came to the newest PlayStation update. Resident Evil 3, like the second game and the first one, also received a full remake in late 2020, and I have now experienced it in all of its glory. Now, the next game that came out was not a numbered entry, but sort of a side entry, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Now, most consider this to actually be the true sequel to Resident Evil 2 because it follows up where the second game left us. Now, I played Code Veronica for the first time back in like 2016, again, once it received a port, and I ended up really loving it. I couldn't believe that I had never played this one before. It was released back in the day on the Dreamcast of all consoles, and it's an underrated fan favorite that has not received any updated remake, but is in very high demand to be done. So, one day, hopefully. One day. Now, here is where the Resident Evil franchise takes a big turn creatively. In 2005, with all the 90s survival horror formulas kind of growing old and stale and in need of some refinement, Capcom took a huge risk and tried something extremely new and innovative when they released the fourth entry in the franchise. Resident Evil 4 released in January of 2005 and absolutely took the gaming world by storm. Completely changing the gameplay style of the previous games, the developers switched the style from the fixed camera angles we become familiar with and the tank controls to a behind-the-back third-person, over-the-shoulder perspective. And believe me, this wound up being the exact change that the franchise needed. The game went on not only to be a high mark and a staple of just the Resident Evil franchise, but also gaming history. This was hailed as one of the most important and innovative video games ever made, as the complete experience to play the game with such freedom of choice was a formula implemented in gaming for many years to come that followed the example set by Resident Evil 4. Like the first three entries in the franchise, Resident Evil 4 also received the full remake treatment itself in 2023. Man, I gotta tell you, I did not think it was possible for them to improve on an already perfect game, but they somehow pulled it off. It was better in ways I didn't even know it could be better. The Resident Evil 4 remake was a monumental achievement. Resident Evil 4 was an absolute juggernaut of beauty and still remains one of the greatest video games ever made. To quote Matt Casamassina in his 2005 review of the game, "You don't own Resident Evil 4, it owns you." In 2009, the juggernaut that was Resident Evil 4 was followed up with Resident Evil 5. That entry again continued the same over-the-shoulder gameplay as the last one, with updated and better graphics and a bit more dynamic game mechanics. It was an amazing looking piece of work. This entry also took a big step in a new direction in attempting to kind of make Resident Evil co-op for the first time. This is the first game in the franchise where it's essentially a two-player game. Even if you are playing one player, you have an NPC partner that goes through the whole game with you, and you have to share your ammo and your health and make sure that they don't die. There were some mixed reactions to this, as some players didn't like that you now had to share everything, and not to mention it was a bit confusing with your NPC partner who would sometimes not do the thing you want them to do. This option, while ambitious at the time, was a technological attribute that I don't think 2009 gaming software was ready for, just to put it simply. It was such a fun and good-looking game, but could be frustrating sometimes when the computer player would do something completely boneheaded that you didn't want them to do. With a Resident Evil 5 remake currently in development right now, I'm very curious to see how they are going to take the co-op concept that they had in the original game and update it and modernize it in the remake, or if they're even going to keep that element. They may just scrap it altogether and just have you alternate playing different characters or something. I don't know, period. I'm very curious to see what they do when they remake Resident Evil 5. Visually, Resident Evil 5 looked great though, and gameplay-wise, it was fun as hell. Now, in 2012, Resident Evil 6 released. This entry is considered, I'd say, the most polarizing of all the entries. You could call this a Resident Evil All-Stars game, because pretty much every big character from the franchise thus far is in this one. Maybe to the point where it's a bit too much. Now, it amplifies more gameplay elements and options, and it fixes some things from the last game that make Resident Evil 6 much more fun as hell to play. But I think most fans would agree that the horror element that made the Resident Evil games special and memorable was gone. The franchise had basically turned into an action-adventure zombie shooter now. But I personally had a really good time playing Resident Evil 6, but I will admit it wasn't very scary. After this, the developers took a big step back to examine things for a bit. Capcom and the game's developers listened to the criticisms from the fan base and took a 5-year hiatus to hit the reset button. And in 2017, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard was released. This time they did something they had never done before in a Resident Evil game. They made it first person, and had you now playing is a completely new protagonist. Going back to a simple premise like this really helped. No big Resident Evil characters we had known prior to this game appear, with the exception of Chris Redfield in the final scene of the game. But the sheer kind of anonymity of it kind of brought things back down in a grounded sense. And Resident Evil 7 was great. It was taut, tense, scary, and still managed to fit itself into the Resident Evil canon well. And finally, in 2021, Resident Evil 8, or still set in first person, it completely amped up what had been done in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. An equally fun game as it was scary, managing to implement elements of all kinds of atrocities, werewolf, vampire, and even Frankenstein innuendo type of atrocities in here, without it being corny or losing any of its heart. Resident Evil 8 Village was a thundering crescendo of everything we've come to love about the franchise so far. It was definitely a series high for me. Now, there has also been a slew of spin-off games and kind of side games that have attributed to the number entries in Resident Evil, Code Veronica being one of them. I mentioned that one already. There was also Resident Evil Zero, a prequel game to the first Resident Evil, which centers on one of the characters from the first game and her adventures prior to joining everyone else in the first game. This released in 2002. Also, another notable addition of spin-off games we have is the Resident Evil Revelation series, which has 2 entries. More experimental titles. These were very fun to play, and they definitely implemented some different styles and of gameplay and different things that you could tell the developers were trying out a lot of new things with these games. They weren't really supposed to be like efficient. They were kind of more experimental. Now, I will definitely probably talk about more of those at a later date. I played both of them. Also, there was a series of light gun shooter games, kind of similar to what you see when you're in the arcade, that were released around the time the Nintendo Wii came out. Now that we had, an attachable, gun controller with things, Resident Evil definitely felt the need to, jump on that wagon and give that a try. I played those briefly, but didn't dive too much into them. While not necessarily canon, they do add some fun little side stories to the Resident Evil universe. We have reached the end and officially caught you up with every game on the Resident Evil timeline. This is a franchise nearly 30 years in the making, and like I said, Resident Evil will be celebrating its 30th anniversary next year and dropping its 9th title, Resident Evil Requiem. With Resident Evil 9 or Resident Evil Requiem set to release in February of 2026, it has me beyond excited and proud to still be a faithful player of this franchise. Resident Evil 9 Requiem looks to implement a lot of the old and a lot of the new elements from previous games and really give us one of the best gameplay experiences with the franchise we've had thus far. There are some things in there I've never seen done before. In the coming months, I will be posting a full deep dive and review of each Resident Evil numbered title leading up to the release of Resident Evil Requiem in February of 2026. I'll see you back here for it. This is where I make like Arnstein and you make like Rosen. Remember, art is timeless. Resident Evil. Just one niche out of many here in the Time Library. I'll see you next time.